Clara slid the last document across the polished mahogany of the lawyer's conference table. The crisp sound of paper on wood was the final punctuation mark on their 10-year marriage. "Here," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, a carefully curated monotone. "All signed. The house is mine. The accounts are mine. The portfolio is mine." She paused, a flicker of a smirk playing on her lips as she looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time in an hour. Ethan sat perfectly still, his posture erect, his hands resting calmly in his lap. He looked like a man observing a play, not a man having his life dismantled piece by piece. "You," she continued, the smirk blooming into a condescending smile, "get to keep your personal effects, your clothes, your books." Her gaze drifted towards the moving truck visible through the large window, where men were carefully loading boxes labeled kitchen and master bedroom. Then her eyes, cold and dismissive, flicked back to him. "And of course you get your little projects. All those notebooks and that dusty old computer in the study." A small, sharp laugh escaped her. It wasn't a sound of mirth. It was a sound of finality, of judgment. "Good luck with nothing." Ethan's expression didn't change. He simply inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement so subtle it was almost imperceptible. He knew what she saw when she looked at him, a failed idealist, a man whose principles were liabilities, whose passions were worthless hobbies. He knew she and her father, the formidable real estate magnate Richard Sterling, had long considered his work, his focus on sustainable architecture and urban harmony, to be the quaint, unprofitable ramblings of a dreamer. This final act, leaving him with the junk from his study, was her ultimate expression of that disdain. It was a symbolic gesture meant to crush him, to leave him with the tangible evidence of his own perceived worthlessness. She thought she was leaving him with worthless digital dust, a collection of half-finished ideas and obsolete code stored on a humming, obsolete server tower. She didn't know that the nothing she so casually discarded had a name. It was called Aura, the Algorithmic Urban Response Analysis System. It was a project he had poured tens of thousands of hours into, a revolutionary piece of software that could model and predict the long-term viability of urban construction projects with terrifying accuracy. She saw a pile of junk. He saw the future. Within 2 years, that nothing would be worth $8 million, and its first major application would be to publicly expose the catastrophic failure of the very empire she had abandoned him to join. But before we dive into the story of how Ethan turned the ashes of his marriage into a foundation for an empire of his own, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We love hearing from you, so let us know in the comments below where in the world you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back 2 years, to a time before the fall, to a lavish dinner party where the first cracks in the facade began to show. Not with a bang, but with the clinking of wine glasses and the soft, cutting edge of a father-in-law's scorn. The stage was being set for a reversal of fortune so complete, so poetically just, that no one, least of all the architects of Ethan's humiliation, would ever see it coming. The air in the Sterling's dining room was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted lamb. Crystal glasses, filled with a deep crimson Bordeaux that cost more per bottle than Ethan's first car, reflected the light of a grand chandelier that glittered like a captured constellation. It was Richard Sterling's 65th birthday, and the room was filled with the city's elite. Bankers, developers, politicians, all orbiting Richard like planets around a sun. Ethan sat quietly beside Clara, feeling less like a son-in-law and more like a piece of furniture she had been obliged to bring along. He had learned long ago that in these settings, his silence was his most valued contribution. "Ethan, my boy," Richard boomed from the head of the table, his voice carrying an easy, practiced authority. The entire table fell silent, turning their attention to him. I was just telling Councilman Davies here about your interesting proposal for the Westgate Community Center. The word interesting was deployed like a weapon, coated in a thin veneer of politeness that failed to conceal its sharp, dismissive point. Ethan met his father-in-law's gaze without flinching. "I'm glad it caught your attention, Richard." Richard chuckled, a low rumble that invited the rest of the table to join in. A few sycophantic guests obliged with polite titters. Oh, it caught it all right. Green roofs, reclaimed water systems, passive solar heating. It reads more like a manifesto for a woodland commune than a proposal for a municipal building. Where's the profit, son? Where's the efficiency? Councilman Davies, a portly man with a perpetually nervous smile, shifted in his seat. The preliminary cost analysis was a bit higher than we anticipated, Richard. Higher? Richard scoffed, taking a dramatic sip of his wine. It was astronomical. We're talking about a community center for kids to play basketball, not a bloody biodome on Mars. He turned his full attention back to Ethan, his eyes glinting with predatory amusement. Tell me, Ethan, explain to all of us practical-minded folk how spending 30% more on construction for a building that will be obsolete in 50 years makes any sense. Enlighten us with your philosophy. The humiliation was palpable. It was a public dressing down, designed to reinforce his own status while diminishing Ethan's. Ethan felt Clara stiffen beside him, her hand gripping her wine glass so tightly her knuckles were white. He knew she wasn't angry on his behalf. She was mortified by the spectacle. He was, once again, failing to live up to the sterling standard. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, Ethan placed his napkin on the table. He did not raise his voice. He did not betray a single shred of anger. He spoke with the calm, measured tone of a professor addressing a curious class. It's not about philosophy, Richard. It's about mathematics. The 30% upfront increase in cost is amortized over the first 10 years of the building's life through energy savings alone. The green roof mitigates the urban heat island effect, lowering HVAC costs for the entire block. The reclaimed water system reduces the strain on municipal infrastructure, a saving that benefits every taxpayer at this table. And the building won't be obsolete in 50 years. It's designed with modular components that can be upgraded as technology evolves. The most expensive building you can construct, Ethan concluded, his eyes sweeping across the silent, attentive faces, is the one you have to tear down and replace in a generation because you were too short-sighted to build it right the first time. There was a moment of stunned silence. Ethan's response had been too articulate, too logical to be easily dismissed. He had not argued with passion, but with data. Richard, momentarily thrown off balance, recovered with a wave of his hand. Theory, all lovely, lovely theory. In the real world, we build things that make money, not things that make us feel good. He turned to the councilman. Don't worry, Davies. We'll get you a proper design, one with 4 walls, a roof, and a budget that makes sense on planet Earth. The conversation moved on, but the tension lingered. Later that night, as they drove home in Clara's sleek black sedan, the silence was a suffocating blanket. When they finally pulled into the garage of their minimalist, glass-walled house, a house designed by a more fashionable architect at Clara's insistence, she finally broke. You embarrass me tonight, Ethan. Her voice was a low, furious hiss. I answered a question your father asked me, he replied, his gaze fixed on the sterile white walls of their home. You didn't just answer it, you lectured him. You lectured a table full of the most powerful people in this city as if you were their superior. She unbuckled her seatbelt with a sharp click. They were laughing at you, at us. They were listening, Ethan corrected her softly. There's a difference. No, there isn't, she snapped, turning to face him. Not in that world. My father's world. The world that pays for this car, this house, this life. You think your little principles are noble? They're a liability. They make you look weak, naive. He finally turned to look at her, and for a moment he saw not his wife, but a stranger indoctrinated into a faith of profit and power, a faith he could never share. My principles are all I have, Clara. They're what my work is built on. She laughed, the same sharp, dismissive sound from the lawyer's office, a chilling premonition of the future. Then you're building on sand, she said, getting out of the car and slamming the door. Ethan sat alone in the darkness of the garage for a long time. The engine ticked as it cooled. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a chasm opening between himself and the woman he had promised to spend his life with. Later that night, unable to sleep, he went to his study. The room was his only sanctuary in the house, a place filled with his books, his sketches, and in the corner the unassuming black server tower. He powered it on, and the quiet hum filled the silence. On the screen, lines of code glowed in the darkness. He began to type, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He was refining Aura's predictive models, feeding it data on material stress, energy consumption, and long-term environmental impact. While Clara slept in their cold, modern bedroom, dreaming of status and stock prices, Ethan was building. He was building on a foundation far stronger than sand. He was building on the unshakable bedrock of truth, one line of code at a time. The world saw him as a dreamer. They had no idea he was the only one living in reality. The humiliation at the dinner party was a prelude, a soft opening for the main event. The true betrayal, the one that severed the last threads of professional trust and set Ethan on a path of forced independence, came 6 months later in the sterile, air-conditioned confines of a boardroom. The firm he had co-founded with Marcus Thorne and Hayes Architects, had been his professional home for over a decade. He was Hayes, the visionary, the designer, the soul of the company. Marcus was the pragmatist, the numbers guy, the one who glad-handed clients and managed the bottom line. They had been a perfect team, or so Ethan had believed. Their partnership was built on a shared dream from their university days, to create architecture that was both beautiful and responsible. But dreams, Ethan was learning, had a tendency to curdle under the heat of a large enough check. The project on the table was the largest in their firm's history, a multi-tower residential development for Sterling Enterprises, Richard's company. It was a legacy project, the kind that could define a career. For months, Ethan had poured everything he had into the design. It was the culmination of all his ideals, a masterpiece of sustainable engineering and community-focused design. It featured innovative energy-sharing grids between the towers, extensive green spaces that doubled as stormwater management systems, and a construction plan that prioritized locally sourced, low-impact materials. It was ambitious, forward-thinking, and, according to Ethan's exhaustive projections, it would be immensely profitable over the long term, creating a landmark that would appreciate in value for a century. He entered the boardroom that morning with a sense of quiet pride. He was prepared. His presentation was flawless, the renderings were breathtaking, and the data was irrefutable. Richard was there, of course, seated at the head of the table like a king holding court. Clara sat beside him, not as Ethan's wife, but as a newly appointed vice president of development for her father's company. Her presence felt like a warning bell he had failed to heed. Marcus gave him a tight, unreadable smile as he set up his laptop. "All right, Ethan, show us what you've got," Richard said, his tone impatient. "Let's see if you've come down from the clouds since our little chat." Ethan ignored the jibe. He launched into his presentation, his voice filled with a passion he rarely showed. He walked them through the design, explaining not just the what, but the why behind every choice. He spoke of legacy, of building a community, not just a complex. He showed them the data from his Aura simulations, preliminary as they were, which demonstrated the long-term financial and environmental benefits. For a moment, he thought he had them. He saw flickers of genuine interest in the eyes of Richard's junior executives. When he finished, there was a polite, lukewarm applause. He looked to Marcus for support, but his partner was staring down at the table, avoiding his gaze. "Very aspirational, Ethan," Richard said, steepling his fingers. "A beautiful vision, but not a practical one. The material costs are prohibitive, the construction timeline is too long, and these energy-sharing grids sound like a maintenance nightmare." He leaned forward. "We need to break ground in 6 months, and we need to maximize our square footage profit. This design, as lovely as it is, doesn't do that." Ethan opened his mouth to counter, to show them the amortization charts again, but Marcus cut him off. "Richard is right, Ethan." Ethan turned to his partner, stunned. "Marcus? What are you talking about? We've been over this data 100 times. It works." Marcus finally looked up, and his eyes were cold, the eyes of a stranger. "The data is theoretical. The market is real. That's why I've taken the liberty of preparing an alternative proposal, a more streamlined version of your concept." With a few clicks, Marcus projected a new set of renderings onto the screen. Ethan stared in disbelief. It was his design, his building footprints, his massing and aesthetic, but it had been gutted, stripped bare of everything that gave it meaning. The green roofs were gone, replaced by cheap tar. The community spaces were filled in with more retail units. The innovative energy grid was replaced with standard, inefficient HVAC systems for each tower. The sustainable materials were swapped for the cheapest concrete and steel available. It was a caricature, a grotesque mockery of his work. It was his vision, lobotomized for profit. "As you can see," Marcus said, his voice smooth and confident, "we've maintained the core visual impact of Ethan's design, which we all agree is stunning, but we've value engineered it to be more practical. We've increased the unit count by 12% and reduced the upfront construction cost by a projected 22%. Richard Sterling beamed. "Now that's a presentation. That's a building I can sell." He looked at Ethan, a triumphant smirk on his face. "See, my boy? A little pragmatism goes a long way." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. He looked from Marcus's betrayal to Clara's cool, approving nod, to Richard's smug satisfaction. He was surrounded. This wasn't a discussion. It was an ambush. "You went behind my back," Ethan said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You stole my work and butchered it." "I improved it," Marcus corrected him calmly. "I made it viable. This is what the client wants, Ethan. Our job is to give the client what they want. You've become too rigid, too obsessed with your ideals to see that." Clara spoke for the first time, her voice like ice. "Business is business, Ethan. Marcus made a smart decision. He adapted. You should learn from him." The vote was a formality. The project, in its corrupted form, was approved. The partnership agreement they had signed years ago had a clause, a majority vote on creative direction. It had never been used, until now. Later that afternoon, back at their empty office, Marcus delivered the final blow. He and the firm's other two silent partners had voted to buy him out. "It's not personal, Ethan," Marcus said, unable to meet his eyes. "It's just, we're moving in a different direction. Richard has offered us a retainer for all of Sterling's future projects. This is the big leagues. We can't afford to be held back by ideology." They offered him a severance package that was an insult, a fraction of his stake's true worth. He knew they expected him to fight, to hire lawyers, to drag it out. But he was too weary. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. He saw it all now. The dinner party, Clara's new job, Marcus's secret meetings. It had been a coordinated attack, a corporate coup orchestrated by his own wife and her father. That night, he didn't argue with Clara. He didn't accuse her. He simply went into his study, the one room that was still his. He connected an external hard drive to the old server tower, the one everyone ignored. With methodical precision, He initiated a full backup of the Aura system. Every line of code, every algorithm, every data set he had been compiling for years. He created 3 copies, encrypting each one. One he kept on the hard drive, another he uploaded to a secure cloud service. The third he saved to a small, unassuming thumb drive. As the progress bar crept across the screen, he looked around the study. It was filled with the ghosts of a future that would never be, the blueprints of a partnership now dead, the models of a project now corrupted. Everything he had built in the physical world had been taken from him or twisted into something unrecognizable. But the data transfer completed with a soft chime. He held the small thumb drive in his palm. It was cool to the touch and weighed almost nothing. It was, in the eyes of the world, nothing. But in that moment, it felt like the only real thing he had left. It was his work, his integrity, his future, all condensed into a tiny piece of plastic and silicon. And it was his alone. The final, irreparable fracture in their marriage didn't happen with a dramatic shouting match or a slammed door. It happened in the quiet, minimalist living room of their home, under the cold, recessed lighting that always made Ethan feel like he was on display. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 months after his ousting from his own firm. Ethan had been trying to find his footing, taking on small consulting jobs and pouring the rest of his energy into refining Aura. Clara, meanwhile, was flourishing in her father's world. She came home later and later, her conversation filled with talk of acquisitions, zoning variances, and profit margins. They were living in the same house, but in different universes. She walked in, placing her expensive leather briefcase on the marble kitchen island. She exuded a new kind of energy, a sharp, brittle confidence that seemed to have been forged in the fires of her father's boardroom. She poured herself a glass of Chardonnay without offering him one. "We closed the financing today," she announced, her back to him. "For the development?" Ethan asked, looking up from the book he was reading. "The one and only," she said, turning around. There was a triumphant gleam in her eye. "The banks were practically fighting over it. Dad says it's the most anticipated luxury project in a decade." This was the project that had been stolen from him, the one Marcus had butchered. He had tried not to think about it, to wall it off in his mind. But Clara seemed to take a perverse pleasure in bringing it up, in detailing its every success. It was as if each victory for the project was another confirmation of his failure. "That's good for you," he said, his voice neutral. "It's good for us," she corrected, taking a sip of wine. "I made a decision today, Ethan. A big one." She paused for dramatic effect, a technique she had clearly learned from her father. "I moved a significant portion of our joint assets into the project's primary investment fund. The liquid assets, the stock portfolio, everything." Ethan slowly closed his book. The silence in the room suddenly felt heavy, charged. "You did what?" "I invested it," she repeated, as if speaking to a child. "It's a guaranteed win. The initial offering was oversubscribed, but Dad held a private allocation for family. The projected return is over 40% in the first 3 years. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile of financial ecstasy. "It's the smartest move we could possibly make. This will set us up for life." He stared at her, and the full weight of her statement settled upon him. It wasn't just that she had made a massive financial decision without consulting him. It was what she had chosen to invest in. She had taken the wealth they had built together, including the money he had earned designing buildings he actually believed in, and poured it into the monument of her father's greed and his own professional destruction. It was the ultimate vote of no confidence. She was betting everything they had on the very people who had betrayed him, on the very project that stood against everything he valued. "Clara," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "that project, it's a house of cards. The design is fundamentally flawed. They cut every corner. The energy costs will be astronomical. The structural load calculations are too close to the margin. It's not built to last, it's built to flip. She rolled her eyes, the smile vanishing. Oh, here we go again. Saint Ethan and his prophecies of doom. You're just bitter because they cut you out. You can't stand to see it succeed without you. This has nothing to do with my ego, he said, standing up. He felt a strange calm descending over him, the kind of clarity that comes when you realize you have absolutely nothing left to lose. This is about facts, about physics. You can't cheat gravity, and you can't cheat thermodynamics. Your father's value engineering is going to lead to cascading failures within a decade. I've run the simulations. Simulations? She let out a short, incredulous laugh. You mean on that toy computer in your study? Ethan, this is the real world. We have engineers, real ones, who have signed off on everything. My father doesn't make mistakes like that. He's not making a mistake, Ethan said, the devastating truth of it landing in his own mind even as he said it. He's making a calculation. He and his partners will get their money out in the first 5 years, long before the serious problems start. They'll sell the building to a REIT or a pension fund and walk away clean. The people who will suffer are the residents, the city, and whoever is left holding the bag. It's a predatory design, Clara, and you just fed it our life savings. Her face hardened into a mask of cold fury. How dare you? How dare you question my judgment, my father's integrity? You're so blinded by your own self-pity, you can't see a golden opportunity when it's staring you in the face. This is why you'll always be small, Ethan. You're afraid to take risks. You're afraid to win. He looked at her, at this woman who equated winning with predatory calculation, who saw integrity as a weakness and ruthlessness as a virtue. The chasm between them was no longer just a crack. It was a canyon, vast and unbridgeable. He didn't feel anger anymore. He felt a profound, aching sadness. He had been mourning the slow death of their marriage for months, but this was the moment he finally accepted it. The person he had married was gone, replaced by this cold, ambitious stranger who wore her face. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue anymore. He simply nodded. "You're right," he said softly. The quiet agreement stunned her more than any argument could have. "What?" "You're right," he repeated, his voice calm and empty. "It was a smart move, a guaranteed win. You should have it all." He turned and walked towards the study, his sanctuary, the only place that felt real. He could hear her behind him, confused and wrong-footed by his sudden capitulation. "What is that supposed to mean, Ethan?" He paused at the door, turning back to look at her one last time. A beautiful, successful woman standing in her perfect, soulless house, holding a glass of expensive wine and a portfolio full of poison. "It means I'm done," he said. "I want a divorce." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. This was the quiet before the storm. The moment the chessboard was cleared, ready for a new game to begin. A game she had no idea she was about to play, and for which he, alone, held the rules. In that quiet moment of surrender, Ethan found his first taste of true freedom. 2 years. 2 years can feel like a lifetime, or the blink of an eye. For Ethan, it had been both. The first 6 months were a blur of legal paperwork and the slow, painful process of extricating his life from Clara's. He moved into a small, functional apartment in a less fashionable part of the city. The space was Spartan, furnished with a few pieces of second-hand furniture and the contents of his old study. At the center of it all, like a black monolith, sat the server tower, humming its quiet, constant song of potential. The divorce had been swift and brutal. Clara, guided by her father's high-priced lawyers, had been ruthlessly efficient. She had argued that the bulk of their assets were tied to her family's influence and her future earnings with Sterling Enterprises. She had pointed to Ethan's lack of a steady income since leaving his firm. The judge had largely agreed. She got the house, the cars, the investment accounts, including the one now swollen with the theoretical value of the Sterling Towers project. Ethan got his personal effects, a modest alimony payment that would barely cover his rent for a year, and his nothing. He didn't fight. His lawyer had been baffled by his placid acceptance. "We can contest this, Ethan. We can argue for a larger share." But Ethan had just shaken his head. "Let her have it," he'd said. "I just want to be done." He knew that true wealth wasn't on their balance sheets. It was humming away in the corner of his new, small living room. For 18 months, he lived like a monk. He woke before dawn, worked 12-hour days, and subsisted on a simple diet. He took on enough freelance architectural drafting work to pay his bills, but every other waking moment was dedicated to Aura. He transformed it from a sophisticated simulation engine into a full-fledged predictive analytics platform. He built a sleek, intuitive user interface. He secured patents for his proprietary algorithms. He fed it every piece of public data he could find on urban development, material science, and climate impact. Aura became a crystal ball for concrete and steel, capable of seeing the future of a building with more clarity than the developers who built it. On the other side of the city, Clara and Richard's world was a constant celebration. The Sterling Towers, now renamed the Pinnacle, were nearing completion. Magazine covers lauded Richard's bold vision. Clara, now executive VP, was a fixture in the society pages, praised for her sharp business acumen. The project was a triumph of marketing, a monument to the power of perception over reality. But reality has a way of asserting itself. Whispers had begun to circulate within the construction industry. Rumors of subcontractors cutting corners to meet deadlines, of strange temperature fluctuations in the lower levels, of hairline fractures appearing in the foundation. These were dismissed by Sterling's PR team as baseless rumors spread by jealous competitors. On the second anniversary of his divorce, Ethan put on his only good suit. It was a little loose on him now. He took a bus downtown to a sleek, glass tower that housed the offices of Vanguard Capital, one of the most prestigious and forward-thinking venture capital firms on the West Coast. He carried a slim laptop bag. Inside it was a thumb drive. Nothing else. He was led into a conference room with a panoramic view of the city. Across the table sat three partners, their faces a mixture of skepticism and polite curiosity. One of them, a woman named Isabel Shaw, watched him with particularly sharp, intelligent eyes. She was younger than the others, with a reputation for spotting diamonds in the rough, for seeing value where others saw only risk. "Mr. Hayes," the senior partner began, "your resume is unconventional for a tech pitch. You're an architect." "I am," Ethan said calmly, "and architecture at its core is about solving problems in a complex, dynamic system. That's what my software does." He began his presentation. He didn't use flashy graphics or buzzwords. He spoke clearly and directly. He explained how Aura worked, how it integrated thousands of variables, from soil composition and seismic data to supply chain logistics and long-term energy markets, to create a holistic 4D model of a construction project. He showed them how it could predict cost overruns, identify structural weaknesses before a single shovel hit the ground, and optimize a building's entire life cycle for maximum efficiency and sustainability. The partners were intrigued, but still skeptical. "The theory is impressive, Mr. Hayes," Isabel said, leaning forward. Her gaze was intense. "But this is all simulation. Do you have a real-world proof of concept? A case study where your model has been tested against a live project?" Ethan paused. This was the moment, the culmination of 2 years of silent, solitary work. He looked at Isabel, then at the other partners. "I do," he said. "For the past 2 years, I have been running a live, real-time analysis of a major development currently under construction here in the city. A stress test, if you will." He inserted the thumb drive into his laptop. A new window opened on the large screen behind him. It was a detailed 3D model of a massive, two-towered skyscraper. The partners recognized it instantly. It was the pinnacle, Richard Sterling's crowning achievement. The model was overlaid with a complex web of color-coded data streams. Red lines pulsed ominously around the foundation. Yellow warning icons flickered across the HVAC schematics. Ethan zoomed in. Aura's analysis began with the publicly available geological surveys in the initial building permits. It flagged a discrepancy in the soil-bearing capacity versus the final structural load calculations. This, he said, pointing to the glowing red lines, is a predictive model of subsidence and microfracturing in the foundation. It projects a 5 mm shift in the first 10 years, double the acceptable tolerance, leading to potential water intrusion and compromising the building's core integrity. He switched to another view. They opted for a cheaper, less efficient HVAC system to cut upfront costs. Aura's model, cross-referencing the building's thermal envelope with historical climate data, predicts chronic energy consumption overages of up to 30%, especially in the lower commercial levels. This will result in millions of dollars in unforeseen operational costs over the building's lifespan. He continued, his voice steady and confident, as he guided them through a dozen other points of failure, from the inferior window glazing that would lead to premature seal failure, to the flawed plumbing layout that created a high risk of systemic leaks. He was not just predicting problems, he was showing them, with terrifying, data-driven certainty, why they would happen. The room was utterly silent. The partners stared at the screen, at the slow-motion car crash of a building they had all seen celebrated as a triumph. "Mr. Hayes," Isabel finally said, her voice hushed. This is devastating." She looked at him, her skepticism replaced by something approaching awe. "You're not just predicting the future, you're showing them the receipt for their short-sightedness." The senior partner cleared his throat. "This is proprietary data, of course, for this project." "No," Ethan said, shaking his head. "Everything you see here was generated by Aura, using only publicly available information. The blueprints filed with the city, geological surveys, material supplier specs. The genius of Aura is not in having secret data. It's in understanding the complex relationships between the data everyone already has. It sees the consequences they choose to ignore." Isabel Shaw stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the actual pinnacle building, which dominated the skyline. It glittered in the afternoon sun, a symbol of wealth and power. But now, she saw it differently. She saw the hidden fractures, the failing seals, the coming flood of red ink. She turned back to Ethan. "What do you want, Mr. Hayes?" "I want to build a company that makes it impossible for anyone to build a building like that ever again," he said. "I want to sell developers not just software, but certainty. Not just data, but truth." Isabel smiled, a real, brilliant smile. "Let's talk numbers," she said. "We'll start the valuation at $8 million for a 30% stake, and Vanguard will lead your Series A funding round." Ethan felt a slow wave of vindication wash over him. It wasn't triumphant or loud. It was quiet, deep, and satisfying. He had been left with nothing. And from that nothing, he had built a truth so powerful, the world would have no choice but to listen. In another part of the city, Clara Sterling was preparing for the Pinnacle's grand opening gala, blissfully unaware that the nothing she had mocked was about to bring her entire world crashing down. The receipt was about to be delivered. The news broke not like a thunderclap, but like a virus. It started in a niche online journal, Future Build Tech, known for its deep dives into construction technology. The headline was deceptively dry. "Architect's Aura algorithm, acquired in landmark VC deal, predicts systemic flaws in Sterling's Pinnacle Towers." The article itself was a surgical dissection. It detailed Ethan's presentation to Vanguard Capital, quoting Isabel Shaw extensively on the power and accuracy of the Aura platform. It laid out in calm, factual language the litany of predicted failures in the Pinnacle, the foundation subsidence, the HVAC overruns, the material degradation. It didn't accuse Sterling Enterprises of fraud or negligence. It simply presented Aura's data as a case study in the power of predictive analytics. That was what made it so devastating. It wasn't an attack, it was a diagnosis. From that niche journal, it was picked up by a mainstream financial blogger, then by a major newspaper's business section. By noon, Pinnacle Flaws was trending on social media. By 3 o'clock, Richard Sterling's phone was ringing off the hook. He was in his office, a cavernous space on the top floor of his old headquarters, when his secretary buzzed him. "Mr. Sterling, the lead underwriter from the Pinnacle bond issue is on line 1. He sounds agitated." Richard picked up the phone, his voice a confident boom. "Tom, good to hear from you. Getting excited for the gala tonight?" "Cut the crap, Richard," the voice on the other end snapped. "What is this story about your building falling apart? My investors are calling me, screaming. They're seeing headlines about systemic structural flaws. Is this true?" "It's a smear campaign," Richard blustered, though a cold knot was tightening in his stomach. "Baseless rumors from a disgruntled competitor." "It doesn't read like a smear campaign. It reads like a goddamn engineering report. It mentions an algorithm, Aura, and an architect, an Ethan Hayes." The name hung in the air. "Isn't that your former son-in-law?" The blood drained from Richard's face. Ethan, the quiet, sanctimonious fool he had crushed and discarded. It couldn't be. At the same moment, in her own pristine office, overlooking the nearly completed plaza of the Pinnacle, Clara was staring at her computer screen, reading the article for the third time. Her hands were shaking. Hayes, Aura, an $8 million valuation. It didn't make sense. The numbers, the concepts, they swam before her eyes. The nothing he was left with, the dusty server, the hobby. How could a hobby be worth $8 million? How could his toy be capable of this? Her phone buzzed. It was a text from a friend on the board of the city's most exclusive condominium. "Clara, darling, just saw the news. Is it true? We were thinking of buying a penthouse at the Pinnacle for an investment." Another buzz. An alert from her financial advisor. Sterling Enterprises stock down 12% in afternoon trading. Another, her father. "My office, now." She felt a wave of nausea. The world, so solid and glittering just hours before, was starting to tilt on its axis. She tried to call Ethan. The call went straight to voicemail, his voice calm and professional. The name of his new company, Aura Systems, stated clearly in the greeting. He didn't even use his own name. She hung up, a feeling of pure panic rising in her throat. She grabbed her purse and raced out of the office, down to the street where her driver was waiting. As the car sped towards her father's building, she saw the Pinnacle gleaming in the distance. For the first time, she didn't see a symbol of her success. She saw what Ethan's report described, a beautiful, glittering tomb built on a foundation of lies. That evening, she did the only thing she could think of. She drove to his apartment. She had to look up the address, a fact that struck her with a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. The building was modest, clean but unremarkable. It was a world away from the life they had shared. She found his door and knocked, her knuckles rapping against the cheap wood. When he opened it, he looked different. He was the same man, but the weariness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, centered confidence. He wasn't surprised to see her. He simply stood there, waiting. "You did this," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "You did this to us, to my father. This was revenge, wasn't it? A petty, vindictive plan to ruin us." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her, his gaze not angry but analytical, as if he were observing a phenomenon he had long predicted. This was the moral mirror, the moment he would reflect her own actions back at her, forcing her to see. "Revenge?" he finally said, his voice soft yet carrying an immense weight. "Clara, Revenge is an act of passion. This was an act of mathematics. I built a tool that tells the truth. It's not my fault the truth is inconvenient for you. You targeted us. You used our building as your example. I used the most high-profile, well-documented construction project in the city as a proof of concept, he corrected her gently. A project I happen to know intimately thanks to you. I presented my findings to a group of investors. A journalist reported on it. The market is reacting to the information. At what point in that chain of events did I do anything other than my job? Her anger began to crumble, replaced by a desperate, pleading tone. You could have warned us. You could have come to us, told us what you found. We could have fixed it. A sad, faint smile touched Ethan's lips. Warned you? I did warn you. For years. I warned you at dinner parties when you called me a dreamer. I warned you in boardrooms when you called me an idealist. I warned you in our own living room on the night you took our life savings and invested it in a project you knew was born from theft and deceit. I have been warning you all along. The only difference is, now the world is listening. He looked past her, out into the hallway of his modest apartment building. You said you were leaving me with nothing, Clara, and you were right. You left me with no distractions, no illusions, and no reason to be silent anymore. You thought the assets were the house and the bank accounts. You were wrong. The only real asset was the truth, and you left that with me. She stood there, speechless, the entire architecture of her world collapsing around her. Every accusation she wanted to hurl at him died on her lips, defeated by the simple, unassailable power of his words. He hadn't sought to ruin her. He had simply built something of value, and the light from his creation was now casting her world into shadow. He hadn't pushed her off a cliff. He had simply held up a mirror, and she had finally seen the precipice she had been standing on all along. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The story of Aura's diagnosis of the pinnacle acted like a chemical accelerant on the dry tinder of Richard Sterling's hubris. The gala, meant to be his crowning triumph, was a disaster. Half the guests didn't show. Those who did whispered in corners, their eyes darting nervously towards Richard and Clara. The celebratory champagne tasted of fear. The next morning, the city's Department of Buildings issued a stop work order and announced a full, independent review of the pinnacle's structural integrity, citing the credible and detailed concerns raised in the Aura report. The stock, which had merely dipped the day before, now plummeted. Investors who had once fought to get into the project were now fighting to get out. Lawsuits began to materialize, first from the bondholders, then from the handful of early buyers who had put down multi-million-dollar deposits on the penthouses. Richard Sterling, a man who had commanded rooms with his voice and bent the city to his will for 40 years, was suddenly adrift in a sea of his own making. He blustered and threatened, calling press conferences to decry the digital witch hunt and unproven theoretical models. But his usual tactics were useless. He was fighting against data, against a truth that was as cold and hard as concrete. His rage was like shouting at a spreadsheet. Into this chaos walked Marcus Thorne, Ethan's former partner, the man who had stolen his design and helped push him out, appeared at the door of Aura Systems a week after the story broke. He looked haggard, his expensive suit rumpled, his usual confident swagger gone. Ethan agreed to see him, meeting him not in his office but in the building's sterile lobby. He wanted no part of this man in his new sanctuary. Ethan, Marcus began, his voice strained. I came to apologize. I was a fool. I was greedy. What I did to you was wrong. Ethan listened, his face impassive. He knew this wasn't a genuine crisis of conscience. It was a calculated move for self-preservation. Richard is going to throw me under the bus, Marcus continued, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. He's already telling the board I was the one who oversaw the engineering changes, that I signed off on the cheaper materials. His lawyers are trying to pin the whole thing on me and the firm." "And did you?" Ethan asked, his question simple and direct. "Did you sign off on them?" Marcus flinched. "Yes, but it was under pressure from him. He demanded those cuts. I have emails, Ethan, memos. I can prove he directed it all." He leaned in, his eyes pleading. "I'll testify. I'll give you everything. We can go after him together. We can bury him." Here it was, the test, the temptation to use the very tactics of his enemies against them, to join Marcus in a war of mudslinging and betrayal. It would be easy. It would be satisfying on a primal level. But Ethan looked at Marcus, at his desperate, fearful face, and he felt nothing but a distant pity. To join him would be to lower himself to his level, to become the very thing he had fought to rise above. "My company doesn't bury people, Marcus," Ethan said, his voice even. "We build things. My data is already public record as part of the VC disclosure. The official investigators have requested a copy of the full Aura report on the Pinnacle. I will, of course, comply with their official request, as any citizen should. The data will speak for itself." He paused. "What you choose to do with your emails and your conscience is your business, not mine." He turned to walk away. "Ethan, wait!" Marcus called out. "He'll destroy me!" Ethan stopped but didn't turn around. "You hitched your wagon to his star, Marcus. I can't be responsible for where it crashes." Meanwhile, Clara was trapped in a collapsing palace. She watched as her father transformed from a confident titan into a cornered, paranoid animal. He yelled at lawyers, fired loyal staff, and spun conspiracy theories. In one terrifying meeting, he suggested they declare bankruptcy for the specific LLC that owned the Pinnacle, a move that would protect his personal wealth but wipe out all the smaller investors, including the fund Clara had poured her own and Ethan's money into. "But, Dad, that's everything," she had stammered. "Our entire investment." Richard had looked at her with cold, dead eyes. "It's a write-off, a cost of doing business. We'll survive. We always do." In that moment, she saw him clearly for the first time. He wasn't just ruthless in business. He was ruthless in life. He would sacrifice anyone, anything, his reputation, his partners, even his own daughter's financial security, to protect himself. Her loyalty, her years of striving for his approval, her adoption of his cutthroat worldview, it meant nothing. She was just another asset to be leveraged or liquidated. The foundation of her identity, her belief in the Sterling Empire and her place within it, crumbled into dust. She was standing in the ruins of a life she had chosen, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The choice was no longer between her father and Ethan. It was between her father's lies and a truth she could no longer deny. Months crawled by, each one bringing fresh erosion to the Sterling Empire. The Independent Review, utilizing the Aura platform under a consulting contract with the city, confirmed every one of Ethan's initial predictions. The Pinnacle was declared structurally unsound and unsafe for occupancy. It stood against the skyline like a billion-dollar tombstone, a silent, glittering testament to Richard Sterling's arrogance. His company, drowning in lawsuits and fines, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Richard, disgraced and facing potential criminal charges for misleading investors, retreated from public life, a fallen king in a kingdom of ruins. Marcus Thorne, true to form, cut a deal with the Attorney General's office, trading his testimony and emails for immunity, saving himself but sealing his former mentor's fate. Clara lost everything. The house, the cars, the portfolio. It was all liquidated to pay off a fraction of the debts. The life of effortless luxury she had believed to be her birthright evaporated, leaving behind a harsh, unfamiliar reality. She moved into a small, rented apartment, not unlike the one Ethan had first moved into. The silence and the solitude were crushing. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly a year after the Aura story had broken, She sent Ethan a simple text message. "Can we talk?" He agreed to meet her at a neutral cafe downtown, a place with no memories attached. When he saw her, he was struck by the change. The expensive clothes and perfect hair were gone. She wore simple jeans and a sweater. The brittle, sharp confidence had been replaced by a quiet fragility. The mask was gone, and for the first time in years, he felt he was seeing the woman he had once loved. She didn't try to make excuses or assign blame. She just looked at him, her eyes filled with a profound, weary sadness. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft and hoarse. The words were not a tactic or a plea. They felt like a genuine, painful confession. "You were right. About everything. About the project, about my father, about me. I was so blind. I was so desperate to be the person he wanted me to be. I completely lost sight of who I was. I worshipped at an altar of money and power, and I couldn't see that the man I was married to was quietly building a cathedral of integrity right beside me." She took a shaky sip of her coffee. "I don't want anything from you, Ethan. I don't expect forgiveness. I needed to say it. I needed you to hear it. What you built, Aura, it's not just brilliant, it's good. You're trying to make the world better. I spent a decade trying to convince you that was a weakness, when all along it was the greatest strength anyone could have." Ethan listened, and the last vestiges of his anger, the embers of resentment he hadn't even realized he was still holding on to, finally cooled and turned to ash. He saw not an antagonist, but a victim of her father's indoctrination, of a value system that poisoned everything it touched. Her downfall wasn't a victory for him, it was a tragedy. "I accept your apology, Clara," he said, and he meant it. "I'm sorry for what you've lost." A tear traced a path down her cheek. "The funny thing is," she whispered, "I didn't really lose anything of value. It was all just stuff. The only thing I truly lost, the only thing that ever really mattered, I threw away myself 2 years ago in a lawyer's office." They sat in silence for a few more moments, the chasm between them no longer filled with anger or betrayal, but with a quiet, mutual sorrow for what might have been. He knew then that their story was truly over. There was no going back. His life had moved on, his path now illuminated by the very principles she had once scorned. He was the head of a thriving company. He was respected not for his wealth, but for his vision. He was, for the first time in his life, truly and completely himself. He wished her peace, and he left the cafe, walking out into the bright afternoon sun, feeling not the satisfaction of revenge, but the quiet, liberating peace of a chapter finally, mercifully closed. 3 more years passed. The world turned, and fortunes, once reversed, settled into a new, stable alignment. Aura Systems, under Ethan's leadership, became the undisputed global leader in sustainable urban planning and predictive analytics for construction. The Aura platform was now the industry standard, a mandatory step in the approval process for major projects in cities around the world. Developers initially chafed at the new layer of scrutiny, but they soon realized that building things the right way, the Aura way, was not only more responsible, but in the long run, far more profitable. Ethan hadn't just built a company, he had triggered a paradigm shift in an entire industry. He was no longer the quiet, overlooked idealist. He was a sought-after voice, a respected innovator whose opinion was solicited by governments and corporations alike. Yet the success hadn't changed him. He still lived modestly, preferring the quiet satisfaction of his work to the ostentatious displays of wealth he had once been surrounded by. His new home was comfortable but not extravagant, filled with books and light, and his office, though larger now, still had the feel of a workshop rather than a corporate throne room. Isabel Shaw, who had become a close friend and trusted board member, often joked that he was the only tech CEO she knew who still took the bus to work sometimes, just to observe the city's flow. He was in a new relationship now, with a landscape architect named Sarah. Their connection wasn't built on ambition or status, but on a shared passion for creating beautiful, harmonious spaces. It was a partnership of equals, quiet, supportive, and deeply fulfilling. One evening, while working late in his office, he came across an old digital file, a photo from his wedding day. He and Clara stood smiling, young and full of a hope that now seemed impossibly naive. He felt a brief, distant pang of sadness, not for the life he had lost, but for the two young people in the photograph who had no idea of the divergent paths that lay before them. He did not feel bitterness or anger. He felt only a sense of profound, settled peace. The nothing that Clara had so contemptuously left him with had turned out to be everything. It wasn't the $8 million from the initial valuation, a figure that had since grown 100-fold. The money was a byproduct, a consequence of value, not the value itself. The true nothing she had given him was the gift of emptiness. The empty apartment, the empty bank account, the empty future they had planned together. In that void, free from the crushing weight of her family's expectations and the constant, subtle erosion of his own principles, he had found the space to build something true. He had discovered that his greatest strength was not his ability to design buildings, but his unwavering commitment to the truth. His father-in-law's empire had been built on the illusion of strength, on the shifting sands of market perception and ruthless ambition. It was a structure designed to look invincible, but it lacked a moral foundation, and so it crumbled at the first tremor of reality. Ethan's success was built on the opposite principle. It was built on the bedrock of integrity, on principles as solid and unyielding as physics itself. It wasn't flashy or loud, but it was enduring. He closed the old photo and looked out the window at the city lights twinkling below. He saw a complex, interconnected system, a living organism of concrete, steel, and humanity. He no longer saw just buildings, he saw the future. A future he was helping to shape, making it safer, smarter, and more sustainable, one project at a time. The ultimate vindication was not in Clara's downfall or Richard's ruin. It was here, in the quiet satisfaction of meaningful work, in the knowledge that he had stayed true to himself, and in doing so, had created something of lasting worth. The greatest fortune he had acquired was not a number in a bank account, but a life built on an unshakable foundation. And so, we come to the end of Ethan's story. It's a powerful reminder that true value often lies hidden beneath the surface, in the things that society, in its rush for profit and status, might dismiss as nothing. It's a story about the quiet, enduring power of integrity and the idea that the most solid foundations are built not from money or power, but from truth. What do you think is the most important lesson from Ethan's journey? Is it the power of patience, the importance of staying true to your principles, or something else entirely? We would love to read your thoughts in the comments section below. Your insights make this community what it is. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel for more content that explores the complexities of human nature and the quiet triumphs of the underestimated. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.